Well, as Colin said, in 1967 we went into Abbey Road to make an album called Obviously an Oracle. Now, the reasons for making that album were threefold, really. I mean, the first one was that we were getting really fed up with the fact that the managers and agents, and we weren't alone in this was happening all over the place, because most of the managers and agents for the bands at that time thought rock and roll was only going to last for 2 or 3 years. And I mean, the irony is, of course, it's lasted longer than any other form of popular music. But they thought that they'd better make as much money out of their charges as they possibly could in that 2 or 3 years. So even though we had #1 records, we had hits around the world, which we only found out about months and months later, because that was how things were in those days. We weren't making any money from the live performance point of view. I mean, for the two writers of that, for Chris White and myself, we had very honest publishers, which was very unusual at that time. And they were paying us what they should pay us, so Chris and I were fine. But the rest of the guys really were just breaking even. And I remember the guitarist coming up to us one day and saying, listen guys, I'm getting married, I've got my money, so I'm going to have to move on, I'm going to have to leave the band. And then Chris and I, who shared a flat at that time, we had a chat and we said, do you know what, if the band were to break up, we have to make an album ourselves in the way that we want our songs to be projected. Because the previous few singles, in our opinion, in the whole band's opinion, were very, very frustrating from a production point of view. And in those days, there was only 4 tracks, so how the producer was mixing the tracks as you did the recording is how they would always be. And we were very frustrated with this. And we didn't know if we could produce an album ourselves, but we went to CBS, they gave us some money, and we went into Abbey Road to make an album. Now, we had 2 huge pieces of luck. The first, both of them connected to the Beatles, because the Beatles had just recorded Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and they just walked out of Abbey Road, and then 3 days later we walked in, and we started to record our album. Now, a couple of great things that the Beatles left behind. First of all, they left their instruments all over the and secondly, and I'll pull those 2 things together in a second, because secondly, Lennon had heard, I mean, we'd all been knocked out a few months previously with Brian Wilson's Pet Sounds, and John Lennon had heard that Brian had recorded it on an 8-track machine. Now you have to realise, in these days when you could record on 100, 150 tracks, you know, none of that's a big deal, but in those days, everybody recorded on 4 tracks, and you were stuck with what you recorded. But 8 tracks seemed like a revelation, and he said to the guys at Abbey Road, you've got to get us an 8-track machine. And they said, well, we can't, because there are no 8 tracks in the country. And John Lennon, with his very short sort of, not concentration span, but you know, what he was prepared to take on. Said, well, look guys, I'm going home in half an hour, but sort it out. So the guys stayed up all night, and these fantastic technicians and engineers worked out a system which was brand new at the time, of syncing together 2 4-track machines in a perfect way. Wow. And you had to lose one of the tracks out of the 8, so, but you ended up with 7 tracks. Now, we inherited immediately these, first of all, the Beatles instruments, secondly, this new technology. And it meant, for instance, you know, from my point of view, it was wonderful, because one of the things that Lennon left behind was a mellotron. And I leapt onto this thing, and because we suddenly had 7 tracks and not just 4, we would record what we'd rehearsed, and usually I'd be playing maybe piano, on most of the tracks I'd be playing piano, and then I'd have the mellotron on a separate track that I could overlay, and it became a real signature of the album, so that was a huge piece of luck. And the second piece of luck, allied to the fact that we had 7 tracks, was that, I'll give you one example. When we recorded Time of the Season, we had Jeff Emmerich, who was an absolutely brilliant engineer, wonderfully intuitive and instinctive, and he just really had ears of gold. And on Time of the Season, for instance, the bit that goes boom, 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 that bit, that's bass and tom-tom. And he got the most fantastic sound out of the bass and tom-toms together. It was quite subtle in a way, but it really sounded lovely. And I've never quite worked out how he did that, but he did. He did it very quickly. He was a lovely, lovely guy to work with, and we retained contact with him really right up until the time that he died. But because we then recorded the track in about 2.5 hours, we had half an hour left over, and we had 3 more tracks. So I remember we were knocked out with what we were hearing, because Jeff had done a great job. And I said to Hugh, our drummer, because we just put a backbeat on it, it was just boom, 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 boom. And I said to Hugh, do you know what? I can hear before the backbeat, and comes just after that. And he said, well, look, we've got 25 minutes left, why don't you just give it a run? And I said, are you sure? He said, yeah. So we ran through it once, and again, Jeff got this fantastic sound out of the clap and the vocal percussion, which I've never been able to replicate since, not quite in the same way. But that was the sort of thing that was happening over the Odyssey and Oracle album. We loved the album, and we thought we'd done the best that we could, all the band did, at the end of it. And we said, well, if the first single is a hit, we'll stay together, otherwise we'll move on. You know? Or in other things musical, we move on. The first single wasn't a hit in the UK, but at that moment, Al Cooper, who was the hottest American producer of that time, had come over. He just signed to CBS with Clive Davis, and he picked up 200 albums in the UK. And he went back to Clive and he said, I picked up 200 albums, and there's just one that I want you to, whoever's got this, you've got to buy it. Doesn't matter how much it costs, you've got to buy it, and we've got to put it out. And he said, well, actually, Al, we own it, but we didn't think it was commercial, so we're not going to put it out. He said, well, you've got to put it out. I said, okay. So they did put it out, but Clive would not let Al choose the singles. So he chose 2 singles, and they were released, they didn't do anything. And then he said to Al, well, okay, we've given it a shot, you know, and we're going to move on now. And Al said, for goodness sake, you must give me my head. You've got to put out my choice of the single. And he said, you've got to put it out Time of the Season. And Clive said, well, it's not really very commercial. He said, well, you've got to put it out. So he put it out. First few weeks, nothing happened. But one DJ in Idaho, in Boise, Idaho, started to play this track frequently, and it spread all over the States like wildfire, and it went to #1 in the whole of the US. And we were so knocked out because some of the people underneath us, if you look through the charts of that particular week, were some of our favourite artists of all time, and there we were at #1, so that was great. But the extraordinary thing was that the album, which didn't sell very much at the time, many years later started to sell, and does in increasing quantities up till today. It was one of the top 100 albums of all time in Rolling Stone. It's just continues ridiculously, and it sells more each year now than it did when it first came out. But the extraordinary thing was that 50 years to the very day that the Cashbox edition came out showing Time of the Season at #1. Wow. On the day we were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So we thought we would like to give you just 5 songs from Odyssey and Oracle now. Short melody. We thought it would be cool to start with the first track on side 1, which is Carousel 44, and end up with the last track, on side 2, which is time for season. So I hope you do.
Dal, can you take a little bit of the reverb off my ears, please? It sounds like I'm singing in the bath. That's the wrong singing in the bath.
This will be
still